All right, so yes, natural transition from beef into tomatoes. So my master's project is tomato variety trials for direct market quality and flavor, or this is a part of my master's project. I'm a master's student at UW-Madison in agroecology and horticulture, working under Julie Dawson. And this is our first season. This past season was our first season doing this project. So the data that I'm going to present to you today is very preliminary. There are a few interesting things that I want to pull out to show you, but there's a lot of places in which we will do things differently in the future, and in which this season was very much laying the groundwork for future work in this area. So this project, the overall research project is a comparative variety trial of 42 varieties of tomatoes for agronomic and direct market quality. And so the overall research questions, which cover the entire project, are these, but I've highlighted culinary criteria because that is what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on what are these culinary criteria and how do we quantify them. And one thing that I should say is that it says direct market quality. Culinary criteria is something that we're considering as part of direct market quality because people are interested in basically, this encompasses flavor, aesthetics, color, things like that, that people are going to be interested in, not just for agronomic performance, but for how the end user values the product. So to give a little bit of background before we dive into the project itself, in 2013, the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture hosted a gathering that probably many of you were present at, and basically they brought together chefs, farmers, and plant breeders, as well as many, many other people, to talk about how those relationships between chefs, farmers, and plant breeders could be reimagined for a stronger food system in which there was more open communication between those parties. And so this quote from Dan Barber kind of summed up for me what the intention of that gathering was, and at that meeting in 2013, Julie met Tori Miller, who is a chef in Madison. And they sort of, along with Erwin Goldman and many other people who were involved, started planning this chef-farmer breeder collaborative that we now have at UW-Madison. That has basically is the focus and the center point of this research, to try to figure out how those relationships between chefs, farmers, and breeders can lead to new, creative, innovative varieties that are going to attract more people to the local food market. And so that is how this project got started initially. But right from the beginning, there's this question of how do you quantify flavor, aesthetics, and direct market quality? And this is something that I'm sure is the same when you're talking about beef, is that how do you, when you ask someone how much you like something, how do you turn that into a quantifiable result? There's some inherent difficulty with that. One is subjectivity. When you have a bunch of people sitting at a table and you're asking them if they think something is sweet or how sweet they think something is, that's going to be different from person to person. A lot of times when we talk to chefs, some of the things that they want, that they're looking for, are they want something that has uniqueness, unique colors, but they also want that classic tomatoey flavor. And you say to them, what's that classic tomatoey flavor? And everyone's answer is going to be different, and what everyone thinks that flavor is or what it's reminiscent of for them is going to be different. So we have the subjectivity issue in there. Also, flavor, aesthetics, and direct market quality are influenced heavily by a variety of chemical and environmental factors. If you give, one thing that we learned very well this summer is that if you give a chef a tomato to taste after it's been very hot and dry, it's going to taste different than after there's been a rain event. And the environment does make a difference. And so that's one thing that we're trying to be cognizant of, but there are many variables included. And also one thing that is interesting, that I found really interesting about this process, is that flavor and aesthetics are very difficult to untangle from preference. So what that means is that if you have someone tasting a variety of tomatoes and you're asking them to assess the qualities or characterize the tomato, so ask them what they're tasting in there, and if you ask them at the same time what their preferences are, what the research shows is that people are going to emotionally respond to a stimuli and pick a preference and say, I like this one. And then they're sort of going to subconsciously or consciously tailor their characterization to include what they think that preference, or what they think the character of the tomato that would be their favorite should be, if that makes sense. So that's sort of a difficult thing that we have to tease out, because we do ultimately want to know what people like, but we also want to know what the things they like taste like, and you can't ask them that at the same time. That violates the sensory evaluation purists like Phil would be angry about that. Okay, so getting into some of the methods. We have 42 varieties and breeding lines that we trialed this summer. These varieties were solicited from all over the country, from plant breeders, small seed companies, independent breeders, and they were selected for unique qualities, novelty, or more often than not for things that were new and hadn't been trialed in the Midwest yet, because part of what we're doing also is an agronomic evaluation that looks at adaptation to our region. So that was an important criteria for us. There were two environments at West Madison Agricultural Research Station where all of the tomatoes were grown. So there were two replications in each environment. There's the organic hoop house and then the field, which is right adjacent to the hoop house. So we tried everything in those two environments, and we tried to standardize them as much as possible in terms of management, and in terms of water, which was crucial. But if there was a huge rainstorm in the field, we did not then overwater the tomatoes to compensate, because a farmer wouldn't. And then we also grew out select varieties on 5 local farms. So basically what this is, we didn't get a lot of data and didn't include many of the farmers' varieties in our sensory evaluation, but since it was the first season, and with any of you who have done any sort of participatory project, it's really important to sort of establish those relationships and get people bought into the project before you start demanding data from them. So we didn't get a whole lot of data from that this summer, but we're looking forward to engaging the farmers more in the actual scientific process in the future. So for our chef's evaluation, the first thing that we did with the chefs to try to get at dealing with some of this subjectivity that's inherent in sensory evaluation is we brought all 5 of our chefs, who are very generous with their time, 5 chefs in Madison, into one kitchen to do an initial sensory evaluation together to sort of calibrate their palates so that they all, could taste something and say, oh, this has a lot of acid, what do you think? And they'd say, oh yes, okay, so this is what we'd call an acidic tomato, this is what we'd call a sweet tomato. And we did that right at the beginning of the season so that moving forward, when they were tasting independently, we could be pretty sure that they were still hopefully somewhat on the same page about their characterization. From the beginning also, the tomato names and growing conditions were disguised, so we used codes for everything to prevent bias. And at the same time as we brought a tomato to the chefs to be tasted, we also froze samples from the same growing environment picked on the same day, so that during the winter time we could take bricks, which is sugar content, titratable acidity, pH, and lycopene readings to try to see how the chemical composition of the tomato matches up with the chef's analysis of how something tastes, or their flavor profile. And then another thing that we did is that we had public tasting events throughout the season. And one of the reasons why this was very important is that usually when you do sensory analysis, you need to have either a small panel of highly trained tasters who spend maybe 2 days learning how to taste something. And because that's not really fun, you usually have to pay them for it. The other option to sort of not have to go that route is to have a large sample size. So one of the things that we wanted to do also is to make sure that the flavor perceptions and the rankings that we're getting out of this are truly reflective of the end consumer and what they want. So it was important to us to have people who would actually possibly be buying these tomatoes be part of the sensory analysis. So we ended up having upwards of 80 people come and taste our tomatoes, and that sample size helped us get some more significant results. And this is an example of one of the flavor evaluation forums that were present at the public tastings. The chef's ones were a bit more in depth. They have things like umami and pungency and flavors like that on on the chef's analysis, but this is the one that we gave to the public. And you can see everything is on a scale from poor to excellent, and then there's an option for too much. And this is another way that we can get at preference a little bit, because it's not ranking, there's the word good in there, which is a value judgment, like this is a good amount. So that doesn't, somebody might say that something that was really high in sweetness was good because they like sweetness. So this is something that we're going to have to tweak a little bit so that we're not trying to capture too much in one question. So we're going to change those moving forward. Okay, so moving into the results a bit. So this is one of the ways that we can characterize the flavor profile of a tomato coming from the chefs. And what you might see up here is that this is the flavor profile. The two tomatoes I'm going to show you are flavor profiles are some of the chef favorites. And you might say, well, I thought you couldn't ask people what their favorites were. How the heck do you know what a favorite is? And what we did to try, another way to try to access preference was ask people for comments. So we had these comment sections on the chef's evaluations, which they were pretty good about filling out. And then we went through and sort of drew out some of the common words that would indicate that chefs had really liked a variety. So words like delicious, very good, favorite, bright, balanced, great flavor, deep flavor. And somebody described a tomato as happy, which I took as being a positive thing, and put into the favorites.
What's umami?
Umami is sort of savoriness. That's what that flavor is. It's a Japanese word that it kind of gets at savory flavor. So this is a tomato that was described as balanced. And I thought it was interesting to see how you can sort of see how on the radial plot there aren't any crazy outliers. It's not super high in sweetness, super high in acid. It's kind of on the lower end of bitterness because that's not a flavor you would expect to see in a tomato. So this is one that was pretty balanced. As you can see, it's fairly circular. The next one is a little bit crazier. It has kind of a spike in umami, kind of a spike in sweetness. But this was one that had one of my favorite descriptions, which is why I wanted to show it to you. This tomato, which is from the Organic Seed Alliance, and so that means it's either a cross between Crimson Sprinter, which is an heirloom, or Wisconsin 55, and a NC State variety. And it was described as having an incredible meaty, savory flavor, sweet and acidic, earthy, with a pleasant fermentation-like finish. And who can argue with that, really? So that's that. And one point that I want to make with that description is that this anecdotal data that we're getting, the way that people choose to characterize with words, is something that is becoming increasingly important in the way that we're thinking about how to do this evaluation. So hopefully in the future we can get some word mapping technology as that continues to improve and look for, statistical overlaps in what people are saying that would hopefully give us some significant storytelling power instead of just significant number power. Some preliminary results on the BRICS analysis. So this is pretty much the thing that we've completed so far this winter is the BRICS, which is the sugar content analysis in the hoop house versus in the field. And this is just one category of tomatoes, the slicers, and that's not even all of the slicers. But we saw similar trends in all of the other categories as well, which include cherry tomatoes, cocktail tomatoes, which are a little bigger than cherries. Heirlooms was a separate category. And what you can see is that for most of the tomatoes, the BRICS content was higher in the hoop house, and for many of them, significantly higher. And this is pretty representative of what we saw with the other categories of tomato too. So we'll have to look into why that is, whether it's the higher heat that's encouraging more sugar concentration, whether it's that they were getting less water than the field. We're not sure, so we'll have to try to tease out what that means in the future.
You said most, it's all.
This one is higher in the field.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and on some of them, it's a little bit more. There's a little bit more parity, so it's not.
Yeah, the error bars.
And the error bars are overlapping in many of them, so we can't make a definite statement about those.
It's probably the static growing. Evenness, control of moisture.
Yeah, I think control of moisture has a lot to do with it, because we did notice a difference. Just personally speaking, and many people who eat and have grown tomatoes, as you would know as well, you taste a difference after rain. You taste a difference when it's been cold. So those are really tangible things in tomatoes. Okay, thank you. So here's another way to look at hoop house versus field, and this is from the category cocktail tomatoes, which are some that are in between slicer and cherry. And the main point of this is that you can't really see too much about the individual tomatoes, but you can see a general trend in the flavor profile. And then you can also see one thing that's interesting on this graph is that the one that's on the bottom, which is Mountain Magic here, is from the field, that did not have a high flavor intensity, according to the chefs. And then the JTO one that has these spikes around sweetness and umami is also from the field. So this is a little bit, so this shows that in the overall flavor profile, maybe there are some varieties that respond differently to the different environments. Whereas with bricks, it was pretty clear that they responded differently in the hoop house than in the field across the board, but there might be sort of a genotype by environment thing going on when you look at the overall flavor profile. So we'll have to dig more into that as well. Okay, so this graph shows the chef's sweetness rating on the y-axis. So this is what the chefs said in terms of what they thought, how sweet they thought a tomato was, versus the sugar content rating on the x-axis. And you can see that there is some correlation here. The R-squared value, which measures correlation, is about 0.45 on this, so it's not great, but it's sort of a hint that that the chefs maybe are on the right track in terms of being able to detect sweetness, levels of sweetness according to levels of sugar. But I had the thought also that maybe the perception of sweetness wasn't determined primarily by the sugar content, and that we should also look at acid content in how people how people detect sweetness and how people perceive of sweetness. So I went and did a multiple regression on the sweetness and the titratable. So the titratable acidity, so that's acidity by volume, and then the sugar content versus the chef's sweetness ratings. And it turns out that the titratable acidity doesn't do much to explain the sweetness. You can't tell very well from this graph, but the correlation doesn't really improve very much when you add titratable acidity. It improves by like 0.1 or something. So really the sugar, at this point, what we can say is the sugar does more, from our small sample size of what we've already completed the analysis on, the sugar does more to explain the chef's sweetness rating than does the acid. So that's good to know. And then moving forward, we have many things. As with any first year research project, there are always going to be lots of things that you want to change going forward. So one thing, and a lot of these came from a meeting that we had with the chefs and the breeders and the farmers this past, just a few weeks ago in January, to try to figure out what to do differently in the future. They want to see more novelty and more variety in the trial tomatoes. So again, they want something that's like crazy colors and interesting, and that they can market as being this really cool new tomato, but they still wanted to have that tomatoey flavor. People wanted to know the stories behind the varieties, so we're going to be talking to the breeders to try to get at some of the history, some of the legacy of some of these varieties. We need to pay more attention to tasting at peak ripeness and water content. So there were a lot, we got not a ton, but some responses that said, didn't rate this because it wasn't ripe. So that's an important thing that we want to pay attention to. We definitely want to simplify the ratings. So as you saw, that whole 1 to 5 scale, people weren't exactly sure what they were telling us when we asked them those questions. And so the chefs wanted to answer questions like, would you buy this again? The farmers wanted to answer questions like, would you grow this again? More simple, but again, that more anecdotal style data that we'll have to come up with a way to analyze statistically. And then we are going to try to find a way to ask people a little bit more about their preferences, but hopefully not violate the rules about sensory evaluation. And the chefs wanted to do fewer weekly tastings. I think they got a little tomato fatigue by the end of the summer. And so they want to have more group events in which we could bring people together. And then also that would really help us standardize, because we could just have a few major tastings, thank you, kind of in a point of the season where everything's going to be ripe. And that will help us avoid having people find things that might be a little underripe or a little overripe, or maybe have been in the field longer and have more disease, and that will give us a better baseline for how to evaluate things relative to each other. And thank you to lots of people who are involved in this project. Thank you to you all for listening.